Right, so Bezalel Smotrich has resigned as finance minister and as a defence minister. So is the coalition government of Benjamin Netanyahu finally cracking up then, Damo? Well, perhaps don't get too excited just yet, because yes, Smotrich has resigned. But as with all things in Israel, as with all things Netanyahu stitches up to suit himself, it's not as simple as that, because in Israel, quitting doesn't necessarily mean quitting at all. And I'll make that claim make sense before the end of this video. It is certainly still a blow to Benjamin Netanyahu, though, because the reason for Smotrich's resignation has everything to do with the return to government of Itamar Ben Gvir and his far-right Otzma Yehudit party following the resumption of genocide in Gaza. A move you would think would cheer him up a little bit, wouldn't you? He's got his little far-right mate back in government with him. They always seemed so close. But it's not been a warm welcome back at all. And if the far-right who hold the reins of Netanyahu's power are going to fall out with each other, there may be nothing Netanyahu can do to save himself if this civil war within his own ministry widens. Right, so the resignation of Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich from Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition government marks yet another fracture in an increasingly unstable far-right alliance, following the flouncing out of government of far-right settler goblin Itamar Ben Gvir, and then his unfortunate return to government to join in again as soon as the genocide in Gaza restarted. Smotrich's departure is as a result of a dispute with Ben Gvir, as it happens, because not only did Ben Gvir walk back into government, no questions asked, but he had the neck to demand more governmental power and more positions for his own rump of a party whilst he was at it. That said, though, Smotrich's resignation isn't really a resignation in the way we all think of resigning either. Israeli politics has been stitched up to be more complex than that. When you get back down to it, it's actually a procedural manoeuvre that's happened here. I'll explain all of this presently, but it is still damaging. It does have the effect of being more serious than just moving deck chairs, so to speak. It is a symptom of a government rotting from within, being consumed by its own extremism, infighting, and the moral bankruptcy of all of its policies. So plenty enough to put a smile on right-thinking people. So much of it designed to keep Netanyahu out of jail, frankly, but particularly with regard to the ongoing genocide in Gaza as well. So let's get into this. The first major sign of instability in Netanyahu's government came at the beginning of this year, didn't it? Courtesy of the big orange bloater that passes for president of the US, Donald Trump, wanting a ceasefire in place in Gaza to make him look good when he came into the presidency, to make it look like he'd managed to do what genocide Joe Biden couldn't. It was all for show. As soon as he got the adulation he'd wanted, genocide could resume for all he cared. Here, Bibi, have a load of weapons even Biden wouldn't let you have, kind of thing. Didn't matter that this was all for show. When you are owned lock, stock and barrel by the settler movement as Ben Gvir is, representing the very worst of the worst, it was a resignation matter. No ifs or buts. We cannot have a ceasefire. Will not agree with it under any circumstances. He tried to get Smotrich to follow him out and collapse the government, but Smotrich was promised more illegal settlements in the West Bank, so he opted to stay for that first phase. But he had told Netanyahu phase 2 of the ceasefire was a no-no. And so we all knew at that point that the ceasefire was doomed never to get that far. And so many of us commentators who were pointing that out were sadly proven correct. The ceasefire collapsed under that pressure, ostensibly from Smotrich, and Ben Gvir then returned to the government, but not without new demands. He insisted on expanded powers and more ministerial positions for his party. And this set the stage for a direct confrontation with Smotrich, caused by Ben Gvir's return to his former post of National Security Minister and that of his fellow Otzma Yehudit politician Avichai Eliyahu coming back into his role as Minister of Heritage. You see, the way Israeli governance works is that under the so-called Norwegian law, so named because of a similar mechanism in Norway, members of the Knesset, MKs, the equivalent of our MPs, who are promoted to a ministerial role, can effectively give up their role in the Knesset itself in order to focus solely on their executive duties. So as a result of that, someone from the down list, as it's called, the list of potential MKs that didn't quite make it, if you like, is brought up to take their place in the Knesset to cover those duties. It would be like having substitute MPs in this country, with ministers no longer having to bother with their constituency work because somebody else would come up from the lower ranks, so to speak, to cover that for them. This means that any MK becoming a minister gives a job in the Knesset to somebody on that down list, but a resignation takes that away again, as the resigning minister, or sacked minister if that be the case, returns to their original role in the Knesset. So when Ben Gvir and Otzma Yehudit quit the government over the Gaza ceasefire, they returned to their Knesset seats. Others came up to replace them as ministers. Members of the Knesset who had come up to replace them when they became ministers themselves left. They lost their job. Now Ben Gvir is back in government, the reverse has happened. Those that came up to the Knesset have gone. Those who replaced Ben Gvir and co in government returned to the Knesset. Now, at the last set of Israeli elections in 2022, Smotrich's religious Zionism party and Ben Gvir's Otzma Yehudit ran on a joint ticket. As a result of this, when Avichai Eliyahu of Otzma Yehudit took his ministerial role when he became Minister of Heritage and therefore vacated his Knesset position, which under the Norwegian law saw a member of Smotrich's religious Zionism party take his place, not another member of Otzma Yehudit. A truly nasty piece of work, as it happens, called Sukkot. Upon resigning from Netanyahu's government, though, Eliyahu returned to the Knesset. This pushed Sukkot out, as is the convention. But apparently upon Eliyahu returning to government now, again though, Ben Gvir and Smotrich have fallen out because Ben Gvir is disputing Sukkot getting Eliyahu's spot again. He wants another member of his own party in this spot, and it is this that has triggered Smotrich's resignation. But arguably the split between Smotrich and Ben Gvir is the most harmful aspect of this to Netanyahu. Netanyahu's government has always been a precarious alliance of extremists, held together only by their shared appetite for Palestinian suffering. But as the genocide in Gaza drags on, as international condemnation grows and domestic discontent rises over the economy, the failure to do what is obviously the easiest way to bring the hostages home, which is through ceasefire negotiation, the failure to achieve any of the aims they said they were setting out for in Gaza, the cracks are becoming impossible to ignore. Smotrich's resignation, even if it is largely procedural, weakens Netanyahu's parliamentary majority and emboldens other factions to make their own demands. You see, by resigning as Smotrich has, under that same Norwegian law, he will now return to the Knesset. It is largely procedural because his return to the Knesset pushes out an Otzma Yehudit MK, Yitzhak Kreuzer, in a swipe across the bows at Ben Gvir. But Smotrich has already filed to return to his ministerial positions the moment his Knesset position is restored. He will then, undoubtedly, block the return of Kreuzer to replace him again, doing to Ben Gvir's party what Ben Gvir is trying to do to his. It is childish, toys being thrown out of the pram stuff between two pathetically cartoonish political villains trying to one-up each other when the reality is they risk putting everyone out of power if their infighting grows. It's a grudge match. Therefore, the resignation of Smotrich is not really a resignation at all. He will be back as a minister within days. This is a game of far-right power struggles within Netanyahu's government. Yet it serves as a reminder that Netanyahu's coalition is also completely unsustainable. A government that sanctions genocide, empowers racists, thrives on division, can't last. Its collapse will be a just outcome, one that Netanyahu, Smotrich and Ben Gvir have all earned through their crimes and seem set to bring upon themselves at that. If forced to choose, to ditch Ben Gvir and his party would not collapse the government, but it would sow divisions amongst the hard-right settlers if Otzma Yehudit are thrown out of the government to keep Smotrich and religious Zionism on side and in the government. Whose departure would collapse the government? It isn't altogether clear if this is something that could even be forced, actually, given that both parties stood on that joint ticket at the last election. It is one thing for Ben Gvir to voluntarily go and take his party with him, but to be forced out might actually cause a constitutional crisis. It might not be as simple as all that. It could be what ends up finishing Netanyahu's regime, that they are so evil they end up destroying themselves. Well, there'd be a certain poetic justice to that, wouldn't there? It's not for us to simply look away or stand by in the hope that this news offers the possibility or likelihood of Israel's extremist government tearing itself apart now, though. Instead, we've got to keep on amplifying the voices of those demanding justice for Gaza, to hold Israel to account for their crimes, an end to the apartheid, and a future where Palestinian lives matter and a Palestinian state exists. And we take a step closer to that if Netanyahu's corrupt government dump themselves out of power and lose all the protections they put in place for themselves for the abuse of their own privilege. The downfall of this coalition should be celebrated if it happens, but not because Israeli politics will magically improve, because that isn't likely to happen, is it? But because the architects of genocide are finally facing the consequences of their own hubris, and that can't happen soon enough. Shall we break out some popcorn in the hope of increased bad blood between Ben Gvir and Smotrich, or is it too early to say? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Meanwhile, if internal divisions aren't of enough concern to Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Houthis firing missiles and drones now seemingly capable of completely evading their air defences like the Iron Dome really ought to be, or is it just a case of Israeli air defences are still subpar from before the Gaza ceasefire? Perhaps they should have invested in that instead of invading the West Bank. Just a thought. But check out that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you have not done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content as well as supporting the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.